So welcome everyone. Welcome to monthly PoSoCoMeS seminar. I'm Jogile Ulinskaitė. I'm associate professor at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science at Vilnius University. And it's my great pleasure this Monday to organize and host this exciting seminar on the recently published book called The Anatomy of Right-Wing Populism, Dealing with Transformational Fatigue in Central and Eastern Europe. So the editors of the book are Jan Kubik and Richard Mole. I will say several words or a couple of sentences about them, but firstly, just a few sentences about the book. I think what's important to emphasize here that it's grounded in empirical research, so it has different case studies and covers many different aspects of right-wing populism. But what's also conceptually very important here that the book examines the two original concepts of neo-traditionalism to capture the construction of the pure people in opposition to the corrupt elites and the threatening others, and neo-feudalism to capture economic strategy whereby a relatively small elite controls the apex of political power and sizable portion of the country's economy. I will not talk more about the book because that will be the role of the editors, but it's even greater pleasure for me to discuss a topic of such relevance in the company of such distinguished experts in the field. So the editors of the book are Jan Kubik, who is distinguished professor in the Department of Political Science at Rutgers University and professor emeritus at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, University College London. His work deals with rise of right-wing populism, culture and politics, memory politics, civil society, protest politics, and social movements, democratization, de-democratization, and interpretative ethnographic methods in political science. Co-editor is Richard Mole, is professor of political sociology at UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies. His research focuses on the relationship between identity and power, with particular reference to nationalism, populism, sexualities, and migration. His research is explicitly interdisciplinary, crossing the boundaries of sociology, international relations, social psychology, and sociolinguistics. And we also have two discussants. I start with Dovile Budrytė, who was born and raised in Vilnius. She currently lives in Atlanta. She's professor of political science at Georgia Gwinnett College, and she also serves as invited researcher at Vytautas Kavolis Transdisciplinary Research Institute at Vytautas Magnus University. Her research interests include memory politics, trauma, Holocaust justice, and gender studies. And the second discussant is Barbara Törnqvist-Pleva, and she's professor of East and Central European Studies at Lund University. Her main research interests include memory, identity, and nationalism, and she has published extensively on these topics. I could say much more about the authors, editors, and discussants, but I think it's much more important to proceed with presentation and discussion. And the way we structure this seminar is that we will start with editors presenting the book and emphasizing what's the most important in their eyes. Afterwards, I will ask Dovile and Barbara to comment on the book and ask questions, suggest comments to the authors, editors in this case, and then I will invite editors to respond to the discussants' questions. And the idea is that we have an hour and a half in total, and it would be great if we have like 20 or 30 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So everyone who's here is very much invited to think about the questions. You can write them in the chat, or you can raise hand and ask them using your mic. So that will be it from me for now. And I do invite Jan Kubik and Richard Mole to present the book.
Thank you. So Jan and I sort of agreed I would start off just with some information about the background to the book. So the Anatomy of Right-Wing Populism is the culmination of 3 years' work by 15 early-stage researchers as part of an EU-funded innovative training network, which is what the European Commission calls PhD training programs. So Jan and I came up with the general theme of the program, namely right-wing populism in Central and Eastern Europe. And then we asked our consortium partners from UCL, Charles University, Jagiellonian University, Corvinus University, and the universities of Tartu and Belgrade to suggest PhD topics relating to populism in Central and Eastern Europe, but specifically related to their own areas of interest and disciplinary expertise. We then grouped the 15 suggested PhD topics into 5 work packages, each of which sort of related to an overarching sub-theme. And these were right-wing politics, the politics of memory, economic populism, politics of othering, and civil society and protest movements. When we came up with the PhD themes, we kept them quite broad, so that the eventual ESRs would be able to sort of fashion the PhD projects in line with their own particular interests and areas of expertise. One of the best things about innovative training networks is that they come with a lot of money for training. So every 6 months, we would bring all 15 ESRs together for training on interdisciplinary research methods and in a range of transferable skills. In the second year of the program, all of the ESRs spent 7 months at one of the partner universities abroad to develop their language and intercultural skills and to conduct fieldwork. In addition, they completed a 3-month period at one of our non-academic partners, which included the European Bank for Reconstruction Development, Amnesty International, Transparency International, to gain access to additional expertise and data, and as well as to gain hands-on experience. So the overall aim of the program was to produce a new generation of populism scholars who were interdisciplinary, multilingual, who had detailed knowledge of the theoretical literature, as well as an in-depth understanding of the historical, political, and cultural context of the region. And so we hope that this is reflected, or that you see that this is reflected in the ESR's research published in the book that we're going to be discussing today. So I'll hand over now to Jan, who will sort of talk a little more about the main ideas of the book.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, Yogila and the organizers. It is really a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. And we are very happy that quite a few people decided to listen to this and we really hope for a discussion as rich as possible. So I will try to be very brief. I'm assuming that some of you, many of you, maybe, I don't know how many, may not have a chance to look at the book in any detail. So the book is organized, as you mentioned, Yogila, at the beginning, around a common conceptual frame, which is, some people followed it more closely than others, but by and large, it all kind of coheres, which was a difficult job because those were doctoral dissertations, so we left them, of course, with quite a degree of freedom to fashion their own projects. So it's a little bit of a patchwork, but it is also, we believe, something that has a degree of coherence. The conceptual model that unites the book, I will mention 3 things: a pretty narrow definition of right-wing populism in 5 points. If we have time, we can quickly go over it. And as you mentioned, the concept of neo-feudalism and the concept of neo-traditionalism. The essence of the concept of neo-feudalism is that the people in power, in this pyramid of power, create 2 redistributive systems. One is to the elite supporters, the oligarchy around them, entourage, and so on. And the other, which is designed for a broader audience. The best example, perhaps, is Polish 500 plus, where every family would get some money for the first child, second child, so on and so on. It kind of kept changing. But the key thing is that those 2 systems coexist, and the first one is, of course, the essence of this kind of oligarchic feudalistic system with a very tight connection between the domains of politics and economy. We also pay a lot of attention from the very beginning to the interaction between the demand and supply sides of politics. That was very central for us. And of course, we try to enter the debate in various ways. Is it more cultural a phenomenon that is explained better by cultural factors or economic factors? And our basic position is that this is always a specific combination of both, but it is something that is pretty contextual. It depends on the place, time, and so on. So it is a more kind of inductive job, at least for now, than deductive, based more on the assumptions that supposedly see clear patterns. We also have a chapter on the remedies at the end, in which we try to go beyond what is usually written in such essays, which tend to concentrate on legal and political measures, and we're looking more into, again, as is the idea of the whole book, to more broader social and cultural factors. And we talked about the restoration of trust and various possibilities, how it could be done, and which emerged again quite spontaneously from our ESR writings, is the idea of decentralization of power, which is one of the phenomena that, of course, right-wing populists and populists in general attack. There's a clear tendency to centralize power when they come to power. So there are 5 sections in the book. The first one is called Illiberal Democracy in Right-Wing Politics. It is just 2 essays that clarify particularly the relationship between neo-traditionalism and the various attempts to legitimize populist power. Then the second part is the economics of populism, which has a lot of interesting stuff around this basic idea of those 2 redistributive systems, but also there's, for example, a very ambitious chapter by Elena Kosu, who tries to kind of model a counterfactual Hungary without Orban. And in her calculations, she shows that the GDP over this period of 10 plus years would have been about 10% higher accumulatively, without the Orban's, what is often called the mafia state, right, by the Magyar. We call it neo-feudalism. And Denis Ivanov has a very interesting chapter. I have no time to talk about the details of it, on the difference between populism, which we call political ideological populism, and the very distinct phenomenon of economic populism and how they relate to each other. Then there is a section on networks of power and resistance. There's a very interesting analysis through tools of network analysis of the networks of Hungarian journalists and how they are destroyed and undermined by Orban and his people. There's also a chapter by Caroline Heilig about the networks within what is called, once Ekir and I call it, the pillarized civil society. So there's this ideologically divided civil society between left and right, and she tries to see how within each pillar civil society organizations worked with political parties. I have no time to go through all the chapters. I apologize to those whose chapters I will not mention. Then there's the next section is on populist discourse and politics of othering. We have anti-Semitism in the Balkans, Islamophobia in Czechia, anti-Ukrainism in Poland, which is a very important, very carefully studied in the chapter phenomenon, and the promotion of heterosexuality in Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in Croatia. And finally, neo-traditionalism and politics of memory. And there's a chapter on the Pegida movement in Dresden, on the Trianon Treaty and its significance in the Hungarian memory politics, and also on the Hungarian minority in Transylvania and what's happening there, and how this is, again, mostly memory, but not only, the whole kind of political culture of the region, how it is politicized due to certain actions coming from Budapest, and kind of resistance of Bucharest in a way. So that is, that's the basic outline of the book. And the final chapter is about remedies, which I briefly mentioned. And I guess I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for introduction and also talking about the project, I think it's important to know the background of the book. And now I give pass mic to Davila.
All right. Thank you so much, Yogila, for this opportunity. And I am really grateful for the opportunity to read the book, The Anatomy of Right-Wing Populism. And indeed, probably my first impression was that it's indeed a very diverse, rich volume encompassing a variety of topics: anti-Semitism, gender and populism, mass media, Islamophobia, economic populism, income inequality, representation of Russia, and so on and so forth. And now, after this introduction, it makes a lot of sense why this volume is so diverse and so rich, right? Because it basically consists of this consortium of scholars who worked on this topic. I really think that it's fantastic that the project was empowerment of young scholars, and it's what a fantastic way for them to get into the field of populist of studies of populism. I think it's a really important project, politically speaking, as well. However, to encompass that many topics, I think that it's probably not surprising that the concept or the definition of populism seems to have been very broad, so that it can be this broad umbrella for all of these topics. And I'm citing here from the book that the book focuses on, quote, the discursive understanding of populism, sees it as a particular mode of political expression or political style. And this approach is intended to show how individuals or groups can instrumentalize a populist rhetoric at particular points in time, right? So it's, if I understand it correctly, the focus is on instrumentalization of populism, specifically instrumentalization of populist discourse, which seems to me, again, rather vague. Almost all politicians seems to be doing this populist discourse that we could say at one time or another, right? Kind of appealing to the people, us versus them, etc. So how do we know then who is truly a right-wing populist and who is not, right? And who's just using populist discourse temporarily, perhaps, since the title of the book suggests that the goal is to explore the anatomy of right-wing populism, right? I think it would be very good to know specifically how to recognize this right-wing populist when we see it. I do have a related question. And it seems to me that perhaps populisms, there's some variety in populisms in Central and Eastern European countries, and not all of them are necessarily purely right-wing. Could there be hybrid populisms? Could there be even left-leaning populisms? And how would they relate to these right-wing populisms described in the book? And would those other populists, right, perhaps left-leaning or hybrid populists, would they still be considered in the class of populist authoritarianism, right? Because one of the most important insights of the book, I think, is linking this right-wing populism to authoritarianism. So right now I'd like to make a couple of remarks about several chapters that caught my attention. And probably one of the most intriguing avenues for theoretical investigations that I found was the attempt to explore the relationship between populism and anti-colonialism, or populism and decolonization. So here, Francesco Melito's chapter number 2, The Illiberal and Neo-Traditionalist Discursive Shift in Poland, was very interesting to me. It had a section on neo-traditionalism and anti-colonialism, right? So the liberal West is seen as a colonial foreign power. This is in the case of Poland. And neo-traditionalists tend to focus on the corruption of, quote, our authentic way of life by these cosmopolitan elites. So thus, this populism becomes linked to a move to decolonize, to resist these cosmopolitan elites, right? And the West then becomes a thief of Polish freedom. Now, it's again interesting that In Georgia, it seems to be a different dynamic. And in Georgia, again, populism is much more linked to Russia. In Poland, obviously, there's no alliance between anti-colonial populists and Russia, which also supports traditionalist values, right? So if you're against liberal West, if you're supporting traditional values as a move of decolonization, so logically, it would seem that there would be a temptation to align yourself with Russia. So a very interesting question to me would be what accounts for this variation between anti-colonialism, anti-Western feelings, and anti-Russian feelings? Why does Georgia then become so different from Poland? Another very interesting and potentially very productive area, especially conceptually and theoretically speaking, would be gender and populism. This is something that I'm very interested right now, and I'm interested in this growing body of literature on the increase of women politicians who are populists. And in the book, this is a prominent theme. I think it's very, very important theme on gender and populism, and it's linked to the theme of resistance. So I really enjoyed reading Carolyn Heilig's chapter in which she wrote about the role of mobilization of women against anti-abortion regulations, so-called conflict zone gender in Poland, and also Mina Baginova's chapter on contemporary feminist movement, transnational mobilizing against anti-gender alliances, also very clearly resistance, the theme of resistance against anti-gender alliance, against those people who are against feminist values. So indeed, very interesting insights on the dynamics of separation, of polarization, and emerging transnational alliances in opposition to neo-traditionalism and neo-traditionalist populism, right? But it seems to me that this is still a rather traditional view of civil society and transnational alliances as progressive, as resisting neo-traditionalism. But what about the uncivil society groups and their mobilization around gender issues? Would the opposition be as powerful, right? And in a sense, also, it's important to ask a question about how populists very successfully use anti-gender discourse, right? So then the question becomes, are all anti-gender actors populists? Which ones are populists and which ones are not? So several more comments on the chapters on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So, according to the book, in those chapters, far-right ideologies, this is well known, they embraced racism, Islamophobia, misogyny, anti-Semitism. So here I'm talking about chapters by Tyrell Ellickson Thu and Carlos Gomez del Tronco. And in Tyrell's chapter in particular, they embraced the argument by Jelena Subotic about the appropriation of the Holocaust memory in criminalizing communism by populists. And this is in the case of Serbia and Croatia. So here I would encourage perhaps more critical engagement with this argument, because again, there's a huge complexity of memories associated with communism, not mere appropriation, right? And those memories of communism are used not just by populists. In many cases, the use of genocide discourse is not so much appropriation, but as a strategy to get international audiences to get recognition for communist crimes, right? So, in this chapter also, I kind of saw a rather standard traditional treatment of anti-Semitism, linking it to anti-Americanism and COVID-19 pandemic. But it seems to me that the situation is much more complex now with the Gaza war and Trumpism. So it's a very difficult question, but perhaps I think it needs to be asked. How does the Gaza factor complicates the conceptualization of anti-Semitism in relation to populism? In many cases, in let's say the case of Marjorie Taylor Greene, she uses the case of Gaza to pursue her anti-Semitic feelings and uses it quite successfully. So in the case of Czechia, populists and far-right actors promote the anti-Muslim policies. Has this changed in the era of Gaza war, right? How does Gaza war complicate the picture? So my last comment is about perhaps the application of insights from the book to other cases. The book focuses on the anatomy of right-wing populism in Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm very curious, living in the United States, what can the Central and Eastern European experience tell us about populism in the United States? Can these cases, insights from all of these rich cases, help us to better understand and resist Trumpism? So thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Davila. I will ask now Barbara to give her comments.
Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me opportunity to make some comments on the book. I just want to start with congratulate both of the editors to this book, which crowns, so to say, several years of work in this research project financed by EU. And I want to say that I find the book really impressive, not least because as many as about 17 researchers that have been involved in it, but also because in my view the book provides quite comprehensive account of right-wing populism, since it pays attention to right-wing populism it's in many dimensions, in political, economic, institutional, discursive, and cultural. And I especially appreciate that you dedicate so much work to cultural dimension, because in my view it has been rather under-researched for a long time in research on populism in general. So my general comment is that this book really is a highly valuable contribution to the body of knowledge on populism, on the right-wing populism in general, and on populism in Eastern and Central Europe in particular. I want to confess that I didn't read the book in its entirety, not from cover to cover, but just parts of it. And I want to focus today just on part 5, because it deals with populism and the politics of memory. And this is a field that I'm very much interested in. So I decided to comment on the chapters in this part, and then to posit some questions both to this part, but also to few general questions to the editors. So Dovile already put a lot of questions, and I add to this burden, so you have a lot of work to remember all these questions, but let us try. The part 5 consists of 3 chapters, extensive chapters. The first one is written by Sabine Volk, and in my view, it deals with Germany, and in my view, this chapter really stands out because she examines populism not from above, which is quite common, that people studying populism look out on state institutions, political parties, governments, populism, and so on. But she studies populism on grassroots level. More specifically, she analyzes how Pegida movement in eastern part of Germany mobilizes participants for regular street demonstrations in Dresden. So it's a kind of close reading of these demonstrations. And what comes out here, it's very interesting, because she demonstrates that memory of democratic movement can paradoxically be used to undermine democracy, because she shows how Pegida invokes the memory of democratic resistance against communist dictatorship in the former Democratic Republic in 1989 to portray itself today as a defender of democracy. So we can see there how a kind of appropriation of democratic memory for illiberal activism that ultimately undermines democratic institutions. So it's a really very unconventional, I would say, study. Then we have two more chapters, and these two chapters both deal with Hungary. Not surprising, because Hungary is in a way kind of champion of right-wing populism in Central and Eastern Europe. And the first of these two chapters is written by Sadecki, who explores how the memory of the Treaty of Trianon from 1920 is today employed in Hungary by Orban's government to legitimize its rule and to garner support for it. So what Orban government does is to tap into emotions that this memory of Trianon evokes, emotions of trauma and loss and even injustice inflicted to Hungary by Western European powers, because as a result of the Treaty of Trianon 1920, Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory. So it's quite easy for Orban's government to instrumentalize these emotions and use them to justify the government's sharp criticism towards the West, but especially towards the European Union. And the government does it, of course, especially in response to the EU criticism of Orban's illiberal policies. What is an interesting finding in this chapter is that Sadecki shows how Orban's populist government adjusts this uses of memory depending on to what audience they are speaking, because when they direct themselves to the Hungarians in the country and minorities, Hungarian minorities outside the country, they flirt with irredentist fantasies of rebuilding greater Hungary, changing borders maybe even, and so on. But when they speak with its neighbors, like for example Slovakia, and they need support of these Central European neighbors in the context of the EU, then they tone down these revanchistic ideas and instead speak more general about uniting Hungarians across the borders, but not changing the political reality. So it's interesting that Sadecki shows this ambivalence and manipulation at the same time. And then you have a chapter, the third chapter there, that is written by Leonid Chiruta, and it connects also to the legacy of Trianon, because it is focused on Hungarian states, Hungary as kin states, and its politics vis-à-vis Hungarian minorities living beyond Hungary's borders as a consequence of Trianon Treaty. And this, I would say that this chapter is partly about memory, because what Orban government does is to evoke a memory of a greater Hungary as a golden age in the past, and implying possibility maybe to return to this golden age. But in principle, this chapter tells as much about this cultural politics and politics of memory as about economic factors that also played a big role in mobilizing these Hungarian minorities behind Orban's government. So this chapter shows this combination of economic incitements, like building museums about Greater Hungary, organizing cultural activities outside Hungarian borders for Hungarians, and even to make it possible so Hungarians can get dual citizenship, and in this way unite, so to say, virtually with Hungary. But these factors are also very much about economy, because dual citizenship gives economic advantage, of course, for people living, belonging to Hungarian minorities and living outside Hungary. So in shortly, this chapter shows how Orban government managed to get support of this minority, so they could even vote through this dual citizenship, vote for the government and strengthen the grip of Fidesz party on politics in Hungary. So it is in short about what these chapters are about. Now let me go to the questions. I have to the editors. So firstly, I want to say that the book argues quite strongly, and especially part that collective memory both constrains and enables populist politics of memory. However, in this part 5, the examples that are presented mainly illustrate enabling effects of memory, cultural memory. So I would like to ask you to elaborate on the ways in which collective memory may constrain populist politics of memory. Maybe it could be discussed in terms of supply and demand framework that you introduced in the book. Secondly, I would like to ask, would you argue that the weaponization of memory in populist politics is especially prominent feature in Central and Eastern Europe compared to other parts of the world? And if so, why? Thirdly, both in part 5 and in other section I have read, I miss a little bit a more elaborated discussion of the emotional dimension of populism. In my view, the strategic management of emotions, especially of fear, envy, pride, shame, and resentment, is one of the main defining attributes of precisely right-wing populism. So could you comment on why this aspect appears to me, but maybe I'm not right, somewhat downplayed in the book? Moreover, in your conclusion, you write that liberals failed to listen sufficiently to people and neglected their need for continuity of values and identities, especially such elements like patriotism, religion, and so on. And you write that instead, liberals offered what you called dry technocratic solutions. And I would suggest that I don't think that it's only about not listening or failing to listening, but also a tendency among at least a part of liberals, radical liberals, and maybe also part of the left, a tendency to condemn those who adhere to traditional values. In many cases, radical liberals and segments of the left constructed what you call, as a feature of populism, a Manichaean opposition between us and them. Us, modern, enlightened, cosmopolitan actors who promote progressive gender politics, multiculturalism, support climate policies, and them, nationalists, narrow-minded traditionalists, blinded followers of authoritarian leaders, or allegedly uneducated populace in general. So this framing often also has taken the form of moral opposition between good and evil, precisely what you also write about in the introduction, which is a case of populism. So this is maybe the question which reminds about Doville's question, which is connected to in general to how to define populism and what is specific with right-wing populism and maybe other populism. I liked very much that you in the introduction provide different conceptualizations of populism, including populism as a mode of political expression or political style that is promoted by Laclau, Moffitt. I would also add maybe Margaret Canavan, and personally I'm very much for this definition. But many contributors to the volume emphasize instead the ideological dimension as a feature, defining feature of populism, and want to define them as populism as a type of ideology. So I would be very much interested to hear how this issue was discussed within your project. And as editors, why did you not attempt to unify the contributors around one definition of populism, but rather make it open? So this is my question. Thank you very much again for this book.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dovile and Barbara, for those excellent questions and comments and a thorough reading of those chapters. That sounds great. I pass microphone back to editors and look forward to their answers. Just a kind reminder to the audience that after the answers, we will have some time for questions from you, so you can type them in the chat or you can raise your hand afterwards. So think about what interests you. So back to the editors.
No.
1 second.
You want to go first? You want me to go first?
Perhaps we can sort of swap in and out. There's a lot to cover there. Really, really useful, interesting questions. And it's interesting because when we finished this, when we got the funding for the Innovative Training Network, all of the money quite rightly went to the ESRs. But those of us that were supervising the projects were also really interested and wanted to do our own research. So the following year, we then applied for more funding from the Commission, and we're very lucky that we got that as well. And so we've generated our own research and are currently in the process of working on publications. And so many of the questions that you've raised are questions that Jan and I have been having, particularly around sort of definitions, sort of whether to, who's we should we prioritize one over the other? Do we understand populism in a sort of a you are or you aren't sense? And sort of what we have, where we've sort of landed is to not to sort of think that you're either populist or you're not. That there are sort of that some people embrace more aspects of the definition of populism than others, or they do so at certain times. As sort of Dovile mentioned, that they will sort of embrace the rhetoric if it's sort of politically expedient to do so. But then in other cases, they know that it's not going to be so politically beneficial, and so they won't. But sort of Jan and I sort of primarily use the sort of the ideational approach, which and particularly this distinction between the thin and the thick. So the thin being the sort of the focus on this sort of antagonism between the people and the elites, in particular, it being an antagonistic relationship, a Manichaean relationship. And that's a lot of, as Dovile rightly said, a lot of politicians sort of adopt that position. And then the thick version is when you seek to sort of reduce the sort of the definition of the people as a sort of a moral community by othering certain communities that would sort of normally would be the ones to sort of challenge sort of populist rule. And we sort of saw this in the edited volume with sort of feminists who were challenging it, sort of the LGBT community, sort of ethnic minorities, particularly sort of migrant communities. These are sort of pushed out of the sort of the moral community. And so that, I think, is sort of part of the sort of the link with sort of authoritarianism, which again was sort of part of Dovile's question, in that certain voices are sort of delegitimized, and these would be sort of the voices usually of those more sort of critical. But I think it's also this idea that populists have this idea that they alone understand what the people wants, that they are the only ones who have the right to speak on behalf of the people, and that they shouldn't be prevented from implementing the will of the people by sort of institutions that aren't directly elected by the people, such as the courts and institutions, particularly sort of international institutions. And so this, I think, is where when sort of populism becomes authoritarianism, is if they are no longer wishing to sort of play the democratic game. They don't sort of recognize the separation of powers. They pack their own people into the Supreme Courts so that the Supreme Courts sort of do not become a hurdle to sort of implementing their will. And again, what you were sort of saying about linking this to the US, we've seen that Trump has tried that, and on many occasions, the Republicans have been very good about sort of circumventing the Supreme Court, and how unhappy he was this week when they actually did stand up to him. So these were just sort of things that sort of came to my mind. I'll sort of let Jan add to this and see if you can remember more of the discussions that he and I have had sort of in this line of inquiry.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so yeah, you touched the most important thing that we are still working on it, and in the next volume, mostly done by more senior people, we definitely are aiming at much more coherence. The dilemma of this project from the beginning was a bit like herding cats, because you have people whom we gave certain freedom, which was necessary because you cannot tell people what to write for their doctoral dissertations. They have to like what they're doing, they have to love what they're doing, they have to be truly engaged. So it was a constant dilemma of too much freedom versus too little freedom. And at the end, it is not satisfactory. I see that point. But in the introduction, we produced the definition, which we think is pretty solid. It is not ideological, it's ideational. We are following Kaz Mude, who was the advisor on the project, by the way. And we are focusing on this distinction between thin and thick. Thin has 4 features. Then if you add this horizontal dimension, the populace thickens by, as Richard said, tightening and producing a much more specific definition of the people. This is a Weberian ideal type, or as people these days write, it is a radial definition, a prototype. and then the real cases approach this prototype to bigger or smaller degree. And this has been increasingly used in political science. You know, all concepts in political science, including democracy, authoritarianism, and so on, are incessantly contested. But I think that radial definition offers, which was tried by, for example, David Collier and his students early several years ago already, and I think it produces some. It is a useful way of going beyond Aristotelian definition, which is pretty constraining. So that's the key thing, and the next book will be much more will be tighter on this dimension. That some very concrete things. I will not be able to comment on everything. Extremely useful. Thank you, particularly that we keep working on it. Yes, variety of populism. I hope you see that once you have this prototype, then various populists approach it in various degrees. It could be typologized to some degree. Maybe we will attempt that. Some people are trying to do that. There are varieties of populism, but we think that that prototype gives the main gist of what it is all about. And for example, Manichaeism is used. I'm just working on LLM analysis of massive amount of political speeches with another partner of ours, Irka Kocian from Prague, and then Richard and I and him are writing a little book also on comparing Polish and Czech populisms, and it is very difficult because in the parliament the politicians do not use that language. Yet if you look at the rally or other events, they do. So this is also the problem of the sampling of proper types of speeches and what is the relevance of the parliamentary speech versus a rally speech and you know, all those issues. Everybody who does this kind of work faces the same dilemmas. But thank you for finding interesting that link between in Melito's chapter between decolonization and neo-traditionalism. That is really one of the main tropes, and very often is used. One thing, if you know, you mentioned that it is somewhat different in Georgia. In that chapter, if you go back to that, Georgia is compared to Ukraine, right? And it is that juxtaposition that allows you to see that, you know, in essence, right-wing groups, because the right-wing groups, far-right groups are compared with Georgia and Ukraine. And in Ukraine, they, for reasons that we understand, have extremely hard time, basically cannot use kind of pro-Russian positions, right? Russophilia is not going to work in Ukraine for obvious reasons, whereas it works very well for far-right in Georgia. So that's, again, I guess, one point about the significance of context. You know, you can milder cases. Those are extreme cases on this spectrum, Georgia and Ukraine. But you know, you can look at Poland and Hungary, and you can see how far right is kind of playing with it. Again, in Poland, it's much more difficult than in Hungary to invoke some kind of pro-Russian sentiment. Gender and populism and uncivil society. We run away. That's you know, something that I've written for years with Grzegorz Ekier. We decided to run away from the concept of uncivil society and just say that civil society has ideological options in it, like the party system, like the political society, i.e. the party system. The same roughly gamut of political ideological options exist in the civil society. And, you know, removing the word uncivil society is one step in this direction of trying to control our own biases and our own sort of, you know, what we like, what we don't like. Obviously, most of us do not like those uncivil groups, but we try to keep the terminology a little bit more neutral. On the Gaza war, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, the fact is that it happened after this was basically done. The project was finished. So they did their field work, and we told them to write mostly about your field work 2 years earlier. This happened, of course, in the fall of 23, and they were done basically early 23 or even earlier with the empirical work. So that didn't go into that, but obviously it is a hugely important issue. Now about collective memory being both constraints and enablers. That's one of my favorite distinctions, that culture can always be one or the other, a constraint or a resource that can be strategically used. You're right, we didn't. That's part of the problem, herding the cats. Nobody wrote about that, so we have gaps in it. I mean, 15 people doing individual projects. I know it's a weak defense, but this is also a project, as you kindly remarked, of showcasing younger scholars who just happen to produce this range of works, not other. The weaponization of memory, is it more? You and I talked about it not once, right? I still don't know. I am afraid that because I'm so immersed in East Central Europe in particular, that I belong to the people who tend to think that we are more cursed by too much memory. But I don't know if anybody tried to measure it. And so, the positivistic political scientist in me says, I don't know. But, for us who are immersed in the region so much, it feels like that, obviously. Needs more on emotions, absolutely. That's something that, it's one of the things we didn't do. I completely agree. The liberals tend to condemn traditionalists and engage also in moralizing politics. Well, that's another huge topic, and the endless debate. We will be writing in this new book. We already are drafting that. We are reviewing that literature on what the non-populist, anti-fascist, and the whole more liberal crowd is trying to do, and which strategies are more effective than others. It's incredibly complicated. I recently communicated with Giovanni Capoccia. You can see he just published another kind of review piece on that in one of the comparative politics journals, and it is a massive amount of literature, and it is still not clear what to do. Lowenstein's the concept of militant democracy is often invoked, and no democracy for the enemies of democracy, and no liberty for the enemies of liberty, to go to the French Revolution and Robespierre. But it's research that, as such as it is, shows that this is not an effective strategy. But on the other hand, you have this idea of cordon sanitaire, and somehow not allowing them to become coalition partners. Some people say that's also a mistake. I am not sure. I am still not able to articulate a clear position on that, just observing how incredibly difficult it is. And I think we just need to keep talking to everybody who will listen about the virtues of liberal democracy and its difficulties, its problems, its imperfections. And, basically, my syllabi always begin with that famous quote from Churchill, that it is the lousy system, but nobody has come up with a better one. And I always start there. And, anyway, that's all I wanted to say quickly. Thank you again. And we have it all in my notes. It will be very helpful in our further work.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, we mentioned that Cas Mudder was one of our advisors, but Ruth Vodak was also on our advisory group. And she gave our ESRs a really interesting talk about the centrality of fear, fear-mongering and scapegoating as a strategy. And so you're right, this isn't something that the ESRs sort of went with. But in the next book that we're working on, and certainly my research, which looks at the instrumentalization of homophobia in Poland, fear for children, sort of discussed at the LGBT community, these were really effective in just sort of getting people out onto the streets. So thank you for raising that. It is a very important point.
And the third advisor was Bela Greszkowicz, and that he was kind of, he's, as those who know his work, a lot of things, but he contributed this amazingly important article about civil society mobilizing those civic circles in Hungary, and that allowed Orban to build this enormously powerful base for his power.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to the questions from the audience. And now it's your time to ask questions which are interesting to you. You can type them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and speak up. Yes, I see Douglas. Go ahead.
Hi. So thanks for the book talk. It's really nice to see so many scholars from all over the world talking about Central Eastern Europe. Really fascinating. Actually, my question regarding populism is that to what extent do we have some form of public collaboration to this? Sorry, give me a moment. How much of it is there like public collaboration to this? Because from what I understand from the chapters that have been briefed, we mostly talk about how the government has been, in some sense, manipulating these poor people who are sold into this whatever extremist narratives that they have. But I believe to a certain extent, these so-called extremist right-wing narratives came from a certain grounded perspective. It could be the people themselves, and they were already having these deep-rooted sentiments and ideologies that are already in existence way before the political parties rose to prominence. So it's not a critique. It's just something to know, because I think most of the world, this is how extremism rise. It all starts usually from the people and not from some catchy marketing government statement, in my opinion. Yeah. So I was just wondering what you think about this, whether it's addressed in the book, within the chapters or not.
Should we answer, or we'll collect
Yes.
more?
I think you can answer, and we will continue then with other questions. I think we still have some time.
Well, this is an excellent question, and I totally agree. And the basic idea is, and we will do much more with this in the next project, which is the constant play of supply and demand. And I've written about it in other places quite a bit, that I am convinced exactly what you're saying. The societies are not predominantly liberal. Actually, most societies are sort of 50-50, or more or less like that. Some are more liberal, some are more conservative. And in one way, no matter what the exact numbers will tell you, there is a large chunk of population in every country you look around, certainly in this country, in Poland, in Hungary, wherever you look, in India, that are traditionalist, conservative, whatever you will call it. And the only interesting question is, to what degree those discourses, ideational maneuvers, ideologies come in, and in what way they kind of build up this constituency and turn it from sometimes this is what's called silent majority, or the silent minority, into an active political agent. And that is the interesting question. And we are trying to deal with it a little bit in this book, but we will deal with it more in the other books, in those two other books. But that is the truly central question, the demand versus supply, and how it actually works. I believe that we're still at the stage we have to build careful case studies, look at it very carefully. Too much generalizing at this stage is premature, but it is the real issue.
And it's also, I think, very important to consider when you're thinking of how to sort of respond to sort of the rise of populism. Because I mean, you're seeing this in the moment in the UK. The Reform Party is becoming increasingly popular, and you know, a lot of the liberal media and liberal politicians are just sort of dismissing reform as sort of rabid right-wing flag wavers. And you know, and a lot of their positions are sort of quite abhorrent, but. If you sort of actually speak to the people who are voting for them, as you said, sort of Douglas, you know, the bottom up, they have sort of real concerns. I mean, you know, a lot of us on this call will sort of, you know, have embraced the benefits of globalization, but it's been really disorientating to sort of a lot of communities. They haven't benefited sort of economically from it. And so we do, and this was something that sort of came up in some of the chapters in the anatomy book, particularly I think whose was it? The Pegida chapter. But you know, everybody is happy to dismiss Pegida for their anti-Islamic position. But actually, a lot of the people who were sort of out on the marches, they're just sort of worried about the future because the economy in Eastern Germany is sort of very poor. They're just sort of worried for the future of the children. So I think it's a very important not to just sort of listen to sort of what the populist leaders are saying, but actually, you know, what were the concerns that got people out on the street to begin with?
Thank you. We still have time for other questions, so if you have any. I see people thanking for interesting discussion in the chat. Yep, I see one raised hand. Go ahead. Dr. Athena?
Hello, good evening. Good evening, all. I'm Dr. Athena. I'm Dr. Athena from India. Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay. I have a very curious. I would like to know who was the main audience for this book? As a simple reader, whether this book is concentrating or addressing academicians, or policymakers, or even general readers like me. So, who is the main audience or the book's focus is on?
Thank you. So it sort of emerged out of sort of PhD projects. So I suppose the academic audience was the sort of the first audience that the ESRs would be presenting to. But as part of the 3-year program, all of the ESRs spent 3 months in a non-academic partner institution. And this was primarily to make sure that they were able to sort of translate their results, their insights into sort of policy relevant sort of documentation and ideas. And so the best way to do this was to learn from people who do this sort of every day for a living. We also had a session where we brought in people from the EBRD, from human rights organizations, from the British Foreign Office, who were not working in academia, but would use the sort of data that our ESRs were generating in their work as well. And so they would give advice on how best to sort of repackage it, lose some of the sort of the academic language, sort of create more sort of clear bullet points and actionable sort of advice. And so we tried to, so every one of the ESRs had to produce a document which demonstrated the sort of the policy relevance of their research. Some of them didn't see that their research was necessarily policy relevant. You know, maybe some of the historians who thought that they were perhaps more sort of academically focused. But following the sort of the placements in the non-academic institutions and engaging with policymakers, they all were able to produce a document which did demonstrate sort of policy relevance. And so we tried to draw out some of those main findings in the conclusion of the book. And so if you haven't read it yet, if you go to that final chapter, then hopefully that will sort of provide more sort of detail for your answer. But thank you for your question.
And if I may add quickly, not all of them, although I think we have a very nice yield in terms of doctorates. But Richard can correct me, but at least two of them are already very involved in the policy world. And, for example, Caroline Heilig, who was my PhD student, she's already a sort of high-level advisor in the German federal government. So that kind of is, we of course, our main target audience would be civil society activists, and we organized some events, but we didn't actually mention it. Much of that work was done during the COVID pandemic, and this really messed up all kinds of things, including methodologies. We have very ambitious program of actual ethnographic studies on the ground, which was scratched for obvious reasons. And then but thanks to that, many of us developed expertise in online digital ethnography, and some of them did that, but it was out of necessity, and yeah, it certainly influenced the project.
Thank you. And I'm using my privilege as a moderator to ask a question, at least one myself. In the title, there is mention of transformational fatigue. And since we talk about Central Eastern Europe, how much of legacies of post-communist transformation explain current success of far right, radical right-wing populism here? I know that, that kind of question requires the whole lecture, but maybe you can give a brief answer.
Well, if I may, because it is something that I cannot stop thinking about. And, my general method of working is, if I have some idea and something sounds very obvious, like, the legacies of communism must play the role here, I immediately think, no, I have to go against that. Or, like Popperian falsification, how can I show that that's not the case? And I recently gave a very long interview on this project and others for one of those key populist websites in Europe. You can find it, European Consortium of Populist Research or something like that. And in the fervor of talking exactly on that question, I ended up pushing perhaps too much the idea that this is pre-communist, that this is still the feudal legacies. I went to this literature. I used to study a lot on the division between two Europes, second serfdom, literature, 16th, 17th century, the different path. It cannot, historical path, it cannot explain why you have populism in Poland, but you also have it in Britain, and you have it in the Netherlands, obviously, which belong to this other European path of development. But I think that I am pretty comfortable with the concept of equifinality. I actually, as an anthropologist, like that concept. You get to the same roughly place through different paths. And in order to be useful for policymakers, you better understand a specific path of a specific country or a group of countries. So I think that in East Central Europe, and there is one chapter that tries to deal with it, like taking more seriously the issue of feudalism, not just neo-feudalism. And I think that has something to do There is this literature on neo-peasantry, neo-peasantism, literature on the rapid advancement of the peasants and workers in the communist countries and the elimination of the elites by the Nazis and the Soviets and all of this. And somewhere there is a part of explanation. And namely, not the lack of now switching to education, of convincing people to the virtues of democracy, despite of its shortcomings. And I wrote about it also in a few places, that there is some data you can use for that. The people are attached to traditional forms of authority, for example. In some, those who vote for right-wing parties, like in Poland for Peace, they at the same time are much more comfortable with more authoritarian view and traditionalist view of politics, which is very masculine, which is very based on the kind of a hierarchical structure. And those people constitute a huge portion of the voting bloc for right-wing populists. They simply are not convinced that checks and balances is a real issue. As Richard said, if someone knows the true will of the people, then it should be realized. And of course, their leaders know that will by definition. And so that phenomenon, but it's still something that needs to be much more unpacked. But my hunch is much more than post-communist legacies.
So I can imagine that also anti-modernist, anti-modernization discourse talks about that also.
Yes, exactly.
I see another hand by Esther.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for this super interesting seminar. And I came because I'm actually a student of visual anthropology, and I'm currently doing my master's field work in Hungary. I don't know how much you're following the current developments. I'm sure you are. And I'm doing my research on kind of like experiences of solidarity and agency in these grassroots opposition communities that are like coming up all around in the country in connection to the TISA opposition party. And well, I find it quite interesting that like this is also like a conservative, more like centrist, but still like nationalist party with quite
the TISA
some,
party, right? You mean the
yeah,
TISA?
the TISA party, yes, with quite some populist rhetoric as well. But their rhetoric is actually to restore democracy. Like they're very much coming, but it's also like in their manifesto they are not super. They're like quite vague about how they would do it. But my question is more basically like how do you see in this context of transformational fatigue, do you see grassroots civic initiatives as genuine antidotes for right-wing populism, or do you think they can also become absorbed into populist logic themselves? Yeah, thank you.
Richard, do you want to say something?
I mean, this was a sort of I remember having a conversation with Federico, sort of one of the authors, and he was sort of very influenced by Ernesto Laclau, and Ernesto Laclau doesn't necessarily think populism is a bad thing. He thinks it's just a way of sort of constituting the people for democracy, and so. I think that might be sort of relevant to sort of what you're looking at. But absolutely, I think when sort of looking at sort of responses to sort of anti-democratic populists, then sort of grassroots organization is absolutely essential. It makes it difficult for the populists to claim that they alone are speaking for the people if it's the people who are themselves organizing. So I think the sort of conducting research into that and see how they're doing it in Hungary is super important. But Jan, you're the anthropologist, so I'll ask you for your comment.
Yeah, well, Esther, I would love if you would stay in touch, because this is really interesting and very important, and something that we've been, our ethnographic project collapsed, as I mentioned earlier, because of COVID. So we didn't field researchers properly ethnographically. It was impossible. But it is a very important part of the puzzle. But it also, to my mind, this is one of my kind of obsessive issues, the difference between right-wing populism and conservatism. And in political science, a very important body of literature, several people prominent these days, like Daniel Ziblatt wrote a book about the interwar Europe, showing roughly that in the countries in which conservatives figured out that they can have a productive alliance with fascists, then democracy died. But if conservatives said, no way, we're not working with fascists, which are very close to right-wing populists, right? That survived. Democracy survived. So each time I read, and I was reading again some news on Hungary yesterday, watching some videos with Magyar and then Orban, and then this cannot get out of my head that Magyar is sort of a conservative, exactly, I see it the way you said it, who tries to behave in the way that, some conservatives here in the United States, very few, unfortunately, manage to stand up to Trump, right? But it is rare. But I said it in various kind of places that the behavior of conservatives is extremely important. The socialists, liberals, they need pro-democratic conservatives, like there's this concept of liberal conservatives, that's pretty much a part of maybe very useful to resist this trend. So obviously, I don't know how you think about it, but I look at this with certain hope. I mean, I'm not, it's not my cup of tea, personally speaking, that this kind of politics, and it is still very immersed in traditionalism and so on. But putting aside my personal predilections, it may be a hopeful development, right?
There's a follow-up on the question in the chat box, asking if it's possible to counter populism with no use of populist rhetoric. And I would add to that also, I was thinking how much of populist language is moralistic language. And I wonder, if it's possible to counter populism without having that kind of moralistic language. And I don't see many examples of successful cases. I just started thinking how, in order to beat populists, you need to have moralistic discourse as well. And I don't know what you think about it. I'm just thinking that, technocratic language, democratic principles language, they do not work. So I don't see many examples of that. So there probably has to be some other kind of moralistic language, not necessarily focusing on traditional values, but on some other kind of moral principles which can counter populist rhetoric. What do you think about that?
Well, I will make a very, very quick remark, and then Richard, I'm sure, has things to say about it. For me, very critical thing is the rule of law and the whole kind of package around the rule of law, which is a question of legitimacy. The rule of law works when people believe in the rule of law, which is, I think that's the avenue. You can show, for example, to women, and there are clear examples of that, who are deprived of their rights, reproductive rights and control over their bodies, that the rule of law will help them to protect themselves against such regimes. So and this was like one of the strategies I attended once, some kind of a session on strategies, that you pick up a very concrete issue and show the damage done by right-wing populists to a specific dimension of the system, like the rule of law, and connect it to people's real life concerns. That can work, but Yeah, this is not a straightforward, quick argument, You're not making anybody great again in 24 hours.
Richard, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of morality, I mean, you're absolutely right that the distinction between the people and the elite is sort of drawn on sort of moral grounds. This is what enables people like Trump, who's hardly a man of the people, is a multi-billionaire, but he sort of presents himself as sort of sharing the Christian moral values of the United States, despite having several affairs and being heavily involved with Epstein. He sort of sells this to certain voters that he is sort of holding the line in terms of morality, and he uses this to sort of to deport people who he says are the worst of the worst. So all of this is sort of defined in moral terms. So you're absolutely right. I mean, in the research I've done, what was noticeable is that sort of morals or sort of moral values aren't fixed. They change over time. I mean, I've been looking at homophobia in Poland for a long time, and it was sort of super effective, and has been super effective. But attitudes towards LGBT rights in Poland have becoming not super liberal, but become much more liberal quite quickly. In just, the past 10, 15 years, the increase in support for same-sex marriage and equal rights for LGBT people has been the sort of the second highest in the EU, and so that sort of the ability of sort of populists to sort of use that as a sort of a moral crusading issue is sort of undermined as sort of society sort of develops sort of over time. Yeah, sorry, I think I was slightly veering off track, but yeah, the issue of morality, I think, is absolutely central. It's just sort of making sure that sort of the narrative about the correct morality isn't given exclusively to people like Trump and Berlusconi and Orban.
Thank you. I think we have time for one short question, if people have any.
I don't think we responded to Marcin's question.
I think
Is it possible to counter populism with no use of populist rhetoric?
Yeah, if you would like to comment on that. There's also continuation on boundary between populism and fascism. That would require a whole another seminar.
Yeah, Jan, you mentioned that. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, well, again, since we have very little time left, I used to think that there will be a way to distinguish them. I'm not so sure anymore. And again, I would, if you take this idea of the radial definition or the famous definition of fascist by Umberto Eco, which is a Wittgensteinian family resemblance definition, 14 elements, and every actually existing fascist picks up some of those 14. I gave this exercise to my students, gave them the Umberto Eco's article, 14 features, and they said, this is Trump, very easily, so picking up several out of those 14. So it really depends also on the definition of the definition, but it is increasingly more difficult to distinguish the two phenomena, I would say.
On that optimistic note, I think we should wrap up our seminar. Thank you for amazing discussion. Thank you for great presentation. Thank you for an excellent book. Thank you for attending this seminar. It was great, and looking forward to seeing you all in following PoSoCoMeS seminars. Thanks. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, Jogila, for organizing, and especially to Dovila and Barbara for the fantastic
exactly
and the questions from the floor.
Thank you to everybody.